St. Genevieve, Missouri Territory, 1808. While American settlers threw up quick horizontal log cabins with notched corners, one French trapper named Baptiste was still digging trenches in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He stood cedar posts upright in the ground like fence pickets, 8 to 10 inches wide, side by side, in a continuous wall trench 18 inches deep. He packed the gaps with mud and straw, built galleries 8 feet wide around the whole house. Standard cabins took 3 weeks. His stockade house took 2 months. Then came the Great Flood of 1844. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers merged into one massive torrent, standing above flood stage for weeks. Water soaked into horizontal cabin sills, pooled in corner notches, and rotted the lower logs from the inside out. Families watched 20 years of work crumble in their hands. But Baptiste's vertical posts shed the floodwater straight down to the ground. No horizontal ledges to trap moisture. No corner notches to hold standing water. 200 years later, when the 1993 flood destroyed a row of modern frame houses along the riverbank, his cedar post house was still standing. What did he understand about water, wood, and rot that an entire frontier full of expert log builders missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Baptiste Beaulieu had learned to read wood the way other men read faces. 20 years trapping along the Great Lakes had taught him that water always finds the low places, settles into the flat spots, and waits. He had watched enough cabins rot from the bottom up, first the sill logs, then the corner notches, then the whole lower course turning to punk while the roof still looked solid. Now standing in the fertile bottomlands of St. Genevieve in the autumn of 1808, he was determined not to repeat those mistakes. The other settlers thought he had lost his mind. While they raced to finish their cabins before the first hard freeze, Baptiste was still marking out his foundation trenches with a hoe and string line. His house footprint stretched 30 feet by 20 feet, larger than most, with a continuous ditch that would run 18 inches deep around the entire perimeter. John Mackenzie, whose own cabin sat finished except for chinking, stopped by most mornings to shake his head at the spectacle. "You building a house or digging a grave?" Mackenzie would ask, watching Baptiste haul bucket after bucket of Black River dirt from his trenches. The other American settlers, families from Kentucky and Tennessee, who had brought their father's cabin-building wisdom with them, gathered around Mackenzie's observations like flies on honey. They knew how to build. Lay a foundation of flat stones, cut logs to length and notch the ends, stack them horizontal with the notches locked together like puzzle pieces, chink the gaps with clay and moss, raise a roof and call it done. 3 weeks of work for a man and his sons, maybe 4 if the weather turned bad. Baptiste's method looked like madness by comparison. Instead of horizontal logs, he was setting cedar posts upright in his trenches like fence pickets. Each post measured 8 to 10 inches across and stood 12 feet tall, with 3 feet buried in the ground and 9 feet above grade. He placed them side by side with barely an inch of gap between them, creating a solid wall of vertical timber around his entire house. The posts came from trees he had cut himself along the river, red cedar that would resist rot even when buried, and white oak for the corners where he needed extra strength. "Posts in the ground are temporary," Mackenzie announced to anyone who would listen. "Good for a pig pen, maybe a chicken coop, but a man's house needs proper foundation." The other settlers nodded in agreement. They had all heard the same wisdom from their fathers and grandfathers back in Virginia and the Carolinas. Horizontal logs on stone piers would last a lifetime. Posts stuck in dirt would rot out in 10 years, maybe 15 if you were lucky. But Baptiste had learned different lessons during his years along the fur trade routes. He had seen Menominee pole houses that had weathered decades of Wisconsin winters, their vertical framework still straight and tight, while nearby trader cabins sagged with rot. He had watched French voyageurs build palisades at remote posts, setting cedar pickets so close together that you could not slip a knife blade between them, and seen those walls still standing 20 years later when the trading companies abandoned the sites. The key, Baptiste knew, was how water moved. In a horizontal wall, rain hit the logs and had nowhere to go but sideways into the chinking or down into the notches, where it pooled and soaked into the end grain. The corner notches were the worst, little cups perfectly designed to catch and hold moisture through every freeze-thaw cycle. But vertical posts shed water like a duck's back. Rain hit the wall and ran straight down the grain to the ground with no horizontal ledges to catch on. While his neighbors finished their cabins and started cutting firewood, Baptiste continued his methodical construction. Between each pair of vertical posts, he packed a mixture called bousillage, river clay mixed with Spanish moss, chopped straw, and deer hair that his Osage neighbors had taught him to prepare. The bousillage filled the gaps completely, creating a continuous wall surface that he would later plaster smooth with lime mortar. Above the posts, he laid heavy oak sills to carry the roof framing, then built steep rafters pitched at 45 degrees to shed snow and rain quickly. The most distinctive feature of his house was the galleries, covered porches that ran 8 feet wide around the entire structure. The galleries served multiple purposes, but their most important job was keeping weather off the walls. With 8-foot overhangs on all sides, direct rain rarely touched the vertical posts or bousillage infill. The deep eaves created a permanent shade that prevented the walls from heating and cooling too rapidly, reducing the expansion and contraction that opened cracks and chinking. By the time Baptiste finished his house in late October, most of his neighbors had been living in their cabins for a month. They watched him hang his door and shutters with a mixture of curiosity and superiority. The house looked strange to their eyes, more like a fort than a home, with its stockade walls and wraparound galleries. Mackenzie calculated that Baptiste had used nearly twice as many logs as a normal cabin the same size, and the extra labor of digging trenches, setting posts, and mixing bousillage had added at least 3 weeks to the construction schedule. "Waste of good timber," Mackenzie declared. "All those logs buried in the dirt where you can't even see them. My cabin's got the same floor space, and I used half the wood." The other settlers murmured agreement. They could see the logic in Mackenzie's approach. Why bury expensive logs when you could lay them horizontal on stone piers and keep them off the ground entirely? But Baptiste's reasoning ran deeper than efficiency. He had spent enough winters in drafty cabins to know that thin walls and poor chinking meant constant battles with cold air and moisture. His vertical post walls, filled solid with bousillage, would be 8 inches thick instead of the 6-inch diameter of most cabin logs. The continuous infill would seal better than chinking pressed between round logs, and the lime plaster over the bousillage would create a smooth interior surface that would not crack and let in drafts. More importantly, Baptiste understood that his buried posts were not wasted timber, they were an investment in permanence. Cedar and white oak could last decades in ground contact if properly selected and set. The secret was choosing heartwood from mature trees, seasoning the posts for a full year before burial, and ensuring drainage around the base. His foundation trenches included layers of crushed stone that would channel water away from the post bottoms, preventing the standing moisture that caused rot. As winter settled over the Missouri bottomlands, both building methods would face their first test. The horizontal cabins, with their quick construction and familiar techniques, represented generations of American frontier wisdom. The vertical post house, with its buried timbers and French colonial details, looked like an expensive experiment. Only time would reveal which approach better understood the fundamental relationship between wood, water, and weather in the Mississippi River Valley. The first signs appeared in the third, spring. John Mackenzie noticed it during his annual inspection of the cabin's exterior, a soft, dark patch along the bottom log where it met the stone foundation. When he pressed his thumb into the wood, it yielded slightly, leaving a small depression that filled with moisture. The rot had begun its quiet work in the corner notches, where rainwater collected and soaked into the end grain of the horizontal logs. Mackenzie was not alone in this discovery. Throughout the St. Genevieve settlement, cabin owners found similar problems developing in their lower courses. The horizontal logs, stacked with precision and pride just 3 years earlier, were showing the inevitable effects of moisture trapped in their joints and notches. Each winter's freeze-thaw cycle had opened hairline cracks in the wood. Spring rains filled those cracks. Summer heat expanded the wet timber, and autumn's cooling contracted it again, widening the gaps where water could penetrate deeper. The corner notches proved especially vulnerable to this cycle. Cut with careful precision to lock the logs together, these joints created perfect pockets for water collection. Rain running down the cabin's sides pooled in the horizontal channels where the logs crossed, soaking into the exposed end grain. Unlike the side grain of the log's length, end grain absorbed moisture like a sponge, drawing water deep into the wood's fiber structure where it could not easily dry. Baptiste observed these developments from his galleries as he went about his own maintenance routine. Each spring, he applied fresh lime whitewash to his vertical post walls, sealing any hairline cracks that had developed in the bousselage infill. The process took him 2 days and cost perhaps $3 in materials. Meanwhile, his neighbors spent week-long stretches rechinking their horizontal walls, hauling fresh clay from the riverbank and pressing it into gaps that seemed to widen each year. The difference in water behavior between the two wall systems became increasingly apparent with each passing season. When spring rains arrived, water hitting Baptiste's vertical walls ran straight down the posts and onto the ground, guided by the natural grain structure of the wood. The 8-foot galleries kept most direct precipitation off the walls entirely, but even when driven rain reached the posts, it found no horizontal ledges where it could collect and soak in. Mackenzie's horizontal cabin told a different story. Water striking the stacked logs had multiple opportunities to find purchase and penetrate. The chinking between logs created a series of horizontal channels that guided moisture sideways into the wall structure. Window and door openings interrupted these channels, creating collection points where water pooled before finding its way into the log joints. Most critically, the corner notches acted as permanent reservoirs, holding water long after the rain had stopped. By the 4th year, the consequences of these different drainage patterns had become visible to casual observation. Mackenzie's cabin required rechinking twice each year, once in late spring to repair winter damage, and again in early fall to prepare for the next freeze cycle. Each rechinking session consumed several man-days of labor as he and his son scraped out loose clay, mixed fresh mortar, and pressed it into gaps that seemed to grow larger each season. The Hartwell family, whose cabin sat on slightly lower ground near the communal fields, faced even more severe problems. Their bottom logs showed not just softness, but actual structural failure. The southwest corner, which caught the brunt of summer thunderstorms, had developed rot so extensive that the corner notch had partially collapsed. The wall's weight now rested on a foundation stone rather than the interlocked log structure, causing the entire corner to settle and creating gaps that let in both air and water. Baptiste's maintenance demands remained remarkably consistent year after year. His primary concern was ensuring proper drainage around the buried post foundations. Each spring, he inspected the grade around his house, adding crushed stone where needed to maintain slopes that carried water away from the vertical timbers. He replaced individual pieces of bousselage infill when thermal expansion had caused cracking, but these repairs rarely exceeded a few hours of work scattered across the entire house perimeter. The contrast became particularly stark during the wet spring of 1812, when persistent rains kept the Missouri River above normal levels for nearly 2 months. The saturated ground could not absorb the additional moisture, creating standing water around cabin foundations throughout the settlement. Mackenzie's horizontal logs, sitting on stone piers just inches above grade, absorbed groundwater through their bottom surfaces and end cuts. The wood's moisture content remained elevated for weeks after the flooding receded, creating ideal conditions for fungal growth. Several families discovered mushrooms growing from their cabin walls that summer, a clear indication that internal rot had progressed beyond surface damage. The fungi appeared first around the corner notches and windowsills, where trapped moisture provided the consistent dampness that wood-destroying organisms required. Once established, the rot spread along the grain, weakening the structural integrity of entire log sections. Baptiste's vertical posts, buried 3 feet deep in well-drained gravel, showed no such problems. The cedar heartwood he had selected for its natural rot resistance continued to perform as designed. More importantly, the vertical orientation meant that any moisture entering the buried sections could drain downward and away from the structure, rather than collecting in horizontal pockets where it would remain trapped. The economic implications of these different performance levels began to concern the settlement's more practical residents. Mackenzie calculated that he had spent over $40 in labor and materials maintaining his cabin during its first 5 years of service, nearly a quarter of the structure's original construction cost. The Hartwell family faced even greater expenses as their corner failure would require lifting the entire structure to replace the damaged logs, assuming the rot had not progressed too far to make repair feasible. Meanwhile, Baptiste's maintenance costs had totaled less than $15 over the same period, mostly spent on lime for periodic whitewashing and stone for drainage improvements. His house showed no signs of structural deterioration, and visitors often commented on the solid permanent feeling of the thick walls and tight construction. Word of these differences began to spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Pierre Menard, a successful trader building a new house in Kaskaskia, sent his carpenter to examine Baptiste's vertical post construction and take measurements of the post spacing and infill techniques. A younger settler named Jacques Delaurier began planning his own Poteaux-en-Terre house, convinced by the evidence of superior longevity and lower maintenance costs. The technological divide that had seemed like a matter of cultural preference was revealing itself as a fundamental question of engineering performance. Water, the universal enemy of wooden structures, was demonstrating which building method better understood its behavior and planned for its inevitable assault on human shelter. The spring of 1844 brought rains that seemed to have no end. By early May, the Missouri River had risen 15 feet above its normal banks, and the Mississippi followed suit, creating a confluence of waters that stretched beyond memory or recorded experience. River pilots who had navigated these channels for decades found familiar landmarks submerged under a brown expanse that reached from bluff to bluff. The Great Flood, as it would come to be known, discharged an estimated 1.3 million cubic feet of water per second past St. Louis, nearly double the volume of the previous record flood. In the bottomlands around St. Genevieve, water stood where it had never stood before. The communal fields disappeared under a lake that stretched for miles, broken only by the tops of fence posts and the crowns of submerged oak trees. Cabins built on what settlers had considered safe ground found themselves surrounded by water that lapped at their doorsteps and seeped through their floors. The flood maintained its grip for weeks, not the usual few days of spring high water, but a sustained inundation that tested every aspect of frontier construction. John Mackenzie watched from his loft window as the brown water crept steadily higher around his cabin's foundation stones. By the third week of May, floodwater had reached the bottom logs of his walls, soaking into the horizontal. Timbers through every gap in the chinking and every crack that 5 years of weather had opened. The corner notches, already weakened by previous moisture damage, became reservoirs that held standing water even as the main flood level fluctuated with each day's rise and fall. The water brought more than just moisture. It carried silt, debris, and dissolved organic matter that penetrated deep into the wood's cellular structure. Where normal rainwater might eventually dry and leave the timber relatively unharmed, floodwater created a saturated environment that would persist long after the surface water receded. The horizontal logs, unable to shed this trapped moisture downward, held it in their fiber like sponges, creating perfect conditions for the accelerated rot that would follow. Baptiste's house told a markedly different story. Built on ground just 2 feet higher than Mackenzie's cabin, it experienced the same flood conditions, but responded with entirely different results. The floodwater reached the base of his raised galleries, splashing mud onto the lower portions of his vertical post walls, but the main living area remained dry throughout the inundation. More critically, when the water finally receded in late June, his vertical posts shed the absorbed moisture in a matter of days rather than weeks. The key difference lay in the fundamental physics of how water moved through the two wall systems. In Mackenzie's horizontal cabin, each log provided a shelf where moisture could collect and penetrate. The stacked construction created dozens of these horizontal surfaces, from the corner notches to the gaps between logs to the window and door sills. Floodwater entering these spaces had nowhere to drain except sideways into the chinking, where it remained trapped long after the external water level dropped. Baptiste's vertical posts, by contrast, allowed gravity to work with the natural grain structure of the wood. Water that penetrated the wall ran downward along the grain lines and drained away at the base, where his carefully maintained gravel bed provided immediate disposal. The bousselage infill between posts absorbed some moisture, but its clay-based composition dried relatively quickly once exposed to air circulation through the galleries above. The contrast became starkly visible within weeks of the flood's recession. Mackenzie's cabin developed a musty smell that persisted despite open windows and doors. Dark stains appeared along the bottom logs where moisture had soaked deepest, and by midsummer, soft spots could be felt by pressing firmly against the wood. The Hartwell family's cabin, which had sat in slightly deeper water, showed even more alarming signs. Entire sections of their lower logs had turned dark brown and yielded to a knife blade pushed into the surface. Throughout the settlement, similar patterns emerged. Families whose cabins had experienced prolonged flood contact found themselves dealing with structural problems that went far beyond cosmetic damage. The Robinson family discovered that their southeast corner had settled nearly 3 inches as the rotted log ends compressed under the building's weight. The Clarks found mushrooms growing from the inside surface of their north wall, indicating that rot had penetrated completely through the log structure. Baptiste conducted his own simple experiment to demonstrate the principle at work. Behind his house, he had stored 2 oak logs left over from his original construction, one positioned vertically against his shed wall, the other lying horizontally on blocks just above ground level. Both had been exposed to the same flood conditions, but their responses differed dramatically. The horizontal log, checked and cracked from years of weather exposure, had absorbed water in every surface fissure and remained damp weeks after the vertical log had dried completely. By autumn, the horizontal piece showed clear signs of rot progression, while the vertical one remained sound. Word of these differences spread beyond the immediate area as families throughout the Missouri River Valley assessed flood damage and planned repairs. Jacques Delaurier, who had been considering vertical post construction before the flood, now committed fully to the method for his new house. He visited Baptiste repeatedly, taking careful measurements of post spacing, trench depth, and bousselage composition. Other settlers, faced with extensive repairs to their horizontal cabins, began asking similar questions about alternative construction methods. The flood's aftermath revealed the true cost of building without adequate consideration for moisture management. Mackenzie calculated that repairing his cabin's flood damage would require replacing at least 6 bottom logs and completely re-chinking the lower 3 courses, work that would cost nearly as much as building a new structure. The Hartwell family, facing even more extensive damage, eventually decided to abandon their cabin entirely and build elsewhere on higher ground. Meanwhile, Baptiste's maintenance needs remained minimal. He spent 2 days scraping mud from his gallery floors and whitewashing the lower sections of his walls, where flood debris had left stains. But the structural integrity of his house remained unchanged. The cedar posts that his neighbors had once mocked as wasteful burial of good timber had proven their worth as an investment in permanence that could withstand environmental stresses that destroyed more conventional construction. Pierre Menard's carpenter, sent originally to examine Baptiste's techniques out of curiosity, now returned with urgent questions about adapting vertical post methods to larger commercial buildings. The practical advantages that had once seemed like expensive eccentricity were revealing themselves as fundamental principles of durable construction in a flood-prone environment. The conventional wisdom that had dismissed posts in ground as temporary expedients was confronting the undeniable evidence of superior long-term performance under extreme conditions. The Great Flood of 1844 had provided an unintended but definitive test of competing building philosophies. Water, the ultimate arbiter of construction durability, had rendered its verdict on which approach better understood the relationship between timber, moisture, and time. By 1875, the frontier settlement patterns around Sainte-Geneviève had transformed beyond recognition. Frame houses with board and batten siding now dominated the townscape, their mill-cut lumber and manufactured nails representing the triumph of industrial building methods over hand-hewn frontier construction. Railroad connections had made dimensional lumber affordable, and most families had either replaced their original cabins or moved to newer structures that reflected their improved economic circumstances. John Mackenzie's grandson walked through the abandoned site where his grandfather's horizontal log cabin had once stood. The structure had lasted just 23 years before rot damage made repairs more expensive than replacement. Foundation stones scattered in the tall grass marked the corners where corner notches had failed repeatedly, each repair lasting shorter periods as the structural integrity of the remaining logs declined. The family had salvaged what sound timber remained for use in barns and outbuildings, but most of the original cabin had been burned as waste material too deteriorated for reuse. Similar patterns had repeated throughout the district. Of the 37 horizontal log cabins built during the settlement's first wave of American immigration, fewer than a dozen remained in service by the mid-70s. Most had been abandoned between their 15th and 25th years as maintenance costs exceeded their functional value. The Hartwell cabin site was marked only by a depression where the foundation had settled and a cluster of volunteer trees growing from the rich soil created by decomposed logs. Baptiste Beaulieu's vertical post house told a markedly different story. Now owned by his son-in-law after Baptiste's death in 1868, the structure continued to serve as a comfortable family home with only minor modifications over its 67 years of service. The original cedar posts remained structurally sound, their buried ends still firm when probed with a steel rod during periodic inspections. The bousillage infill had been renewed twice, once after the Great Flood, and again during the 1860s, but the basic wall system functioned exactly as designed. The house's longevity had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Professor William Trelease from the Missouri Botanical Garden visited in 1876 to document French colonial building techniques for his research on early settlement patterns. He measured the post spacing at 9 inches, center to center noted the 18-inch burial depth, and recorded the composition of the bousillage as river clay mixed with chopped prairie grass and cattle hair. His published observations describe the structure as representing sophisticated understanding of moisture management and thermal mass principles that surpass many contemporary building methods. More practically minded observers reached similar conclusions through direct experience. Jacques Delaurier's vertical post house, completed 2 years after the Great Flood, had weathered 3 decades with minimal maintenance while his neighbors rebuilt or extensively repaired their structures multiple times. The Menard trading post in Kaskaskia, constructed using Baptiste's techniques in 1846, remained the most durable commercial building in the district despite constant exposure to river moisture and heavy use. The economic implications of these different lifespans had become impossible to ignore. Mackenzie's family had invested in 3 successive main houses over 70 years, spending roughly $1,200 in construction and major repair costs. Baptiste's descendants had spent less than $300 maintaining their original structure over the same period, mostly for roof repairs, gallery maintenance, and periodic bousillage renewal. Dr. Samuel Bemis, a physician who had moved to St. Genevieve from Massachusetts, conducted his own informal study of building longevity patterns. His observations, published in the Missouri Medical Journal, noted that vertical post houses maintain more stable interior temperatures and humidity levels than horizontal log or frame construction. Families living in these structures reported fewer respiratory ailments during damp seasons, a correlation Bemis attributed to better moisture control and reduced mold growth within the wall systems. The thermal performance advantages had become particularly apparent during the severe winter of 1872, when temperatures dropped to 28 degrees below zero and remained below freezing for 6 consecutive weeks. Frame houses throughout the region suffered burst pipes and ice-damaged walls as their thin construction provided inadequate protection against extreme cold. Baptiste's house, with its thick bousillage-filled walls and central fireplace positioning, maintained comfortable interior temperatures with significantly less fuel consumption than neighboring structures. These practical advantages had begun to influence building choices among the settlement's more observant residents. Young families starting homesteads increasingly chose vertical post construction despite higher initial costs, convinced by the evidence of superior long-term economics. By 1875, 7 new houses in the district employed Poteaux-en-Terre methods, creating a small but persistent tradition that valued durability over conventional practice. The railroad's arrival had brought not only new building materials, but also new observers who documented local construction techniques. A civil engineer named Harrison Clark, surveying potential sites for grain elevators, noted in his report that the French vertical log houses demonstrate exceptional longevity compared to standard American frontier construction, suggesting principles worthy of broader application in permanent commercial buildings. Academic interest in these structures increased as their rarity became apparent. Professor James Greenough from Washington University documented only 12 surviving Poteaux-en-Terre houses in the entire Mississippi Valley, making Baptista's house and its neighbors significant examples of a vanishing building tradition. His architectural drawings, prepared with precise measurements and construction details, would later prove invaluable for understanding techniques that oral tradition was failing to preserve. The contrast between predicted and actual building lifespans had forced a quiet reassessment of conventional construction wisdom. Standard references continued to classify earth-fast buildings as temporary structures with expected service lives of 10 to 20 years, but the evidence standing in Sainte-Geneviève contradicted these assumptions. Baptiste's house had already exceeded these predictions by a factor of 3, with no signs of structural failure that would limit continued service. Local carpenters had begun incorporating vertical post principles into hybrid construction methods that combined traditional techniques with available industrial materials. These adaptations used milled lumber for posts and plates, while retaining the fundamental moisture-shedding advantages of vertical orientation and deep eaves protection. The results suggested that the core insights behind Baptista's success could be adapted to changing material availability and construction methods. The persistence of Baptista's house through nearly 7 decades of Missouri weather had established a permanent challenge to the assumption that posts and ground represented inferior or temporary building methods. The structure stood as physical proof that proper understanding of wood behavior, moisture management, and thermal dynamics could produce buildings that outlasted conventional construction by generations. Time itself had become Baptiste's most persuasive advocate, making arguments that no amount of theoretical criticism could refute. July 15, 1993. Emergency Coordinator Janet Morrison stood on the Sandbag Levee watching the Mississippi River crest at 49.7 feet, the highest water level ever recorded at St. Genevieve. The flood gauge, installed in 1941, had never measured anything approaching this magnitude. For 49 consecutive days, the river had remained above flood stage, creating a sustained assault on structures that had weathered more than 2 centuries of Missouri. Weather. Along North Main Street, a row of 20th century frame houses built in the 1920s and 30s lay in ruins. The sustained flood pressure had undermined their foundations, collapsed their basement walls, and reduced most to scattered debris that emergency crews were still clearing weeks after the water receded. Insurance adjusters moved through the devastation with clipboards and cameras, documenting losses that would total millions of dollars in this small historic district alone. 3 blocks away, preservation specialist Dr. Rebecca Martinez walked through the muddy interior of the Beauvais Amoureux house with a mixture of professional amazement and personal relief. Built in 1792 using Baptiste Beaulieu's vertical post methods, the structure had survived its second historic flood in 149 years of service. Floodwater had reached 30 inches up the interior walls, depositing silt on the floors and lower furniture, but the basic structural system remained intact. Dr. Martinez pressed her moisture meter against one of the original cedar posts, reading levels that had already dropped to manageable ranges just 3 weeks after the water's recession. The vertical grain structure continued to function exactly as designed, allowing absorbed moisture to drain downward and out of the building rather than collecting in horizontal pockets where extended saturation could feed destructive rot. The bousselage infill showed water stains but no signs of structural deterioration that would compromise the wall's integrity. The Baquette-Ribaud house, built around 1808, presented similar evidence of vertical post construction's flood resistance. Built using the same Poteaux-en-Terre methods Baptiste had demonstrated, It too had weathered the extreme flood conditions with damage limited primarily to furnishings and decorative elements. The buried cedar posts, now nearly 200 years old, remained structurally sound despite prolonged exposure to saturated soil conditions that had destroyed the foundations of much newer buildings. State preservation officials recognized the significance of these survival patterns. The 1993 flood had provided an unintended but definitive test of building durability under extreme conditions. Modern frame houses, with their standardized construction methods and industrial materials, had failed catastrophically, while the French colonial structures had demonstrated remarkable resilience. Within months of the flood's recession, the National Park Service had initiated proceedings to establish Sainte-Geneviève National Historical Park, specifically to protect and interpret these rare survivors of vertical post construction. Contemporary building science helped explain what Baptiste had understood intuitively. Dr. Thomas Keswick, a wood preservation specialist from the University of Missouri, conducted detailed analysis of the flood-damaged structures for his research on moisture dynamics in historic buildings. His findings confirmed that vertical post orientation, combined with proper species selection and drainage design, created optimal conditions for moisture management that exceeded the performance of many modern building systems. The cedar post's cellular structure channeled water downward along the grain lines, preventing the lateral moisture movement that destroyed horizontal log construction. The bousillage infill, despite its clay content, actually improved the wall's flood resistance by creating a monolithic barrier that dried uniformly rather than retaining water in discrete pockets. Most importantly, the deep galleries and steep roof pitches that neighbors had once considered wasteful ornamentation proved essential for keeping direct precipitation off the walls during the extended flood period. Modern log home manufacturers had quietly begun incorporating these principles into their designs. Companies in Canada and the northern United States offered vertical log construction marketed as stockade-style building, promoting faster assembly times and superior insulation values compared to traditional horizontal systems. The marketing materials rarely mentioned the historical precedents, but the technical specifications closely paralleled the methods Baptiste had developed nearly 2 centuries earlier. Building preservation manuals now included detailed guidance on maintaining vertical post structures, acknowledging their superior longevity when properly maintained. The techniques that academic sources had once dismissed as primitive or temporary were being recognized as sophisticated responses to fundamental challenges of wood construction in flood-prone environments. Professional contractors specializing in historic restoration sought training in bousillage, mixing, and cedar post installation to meet growing demand for authentic repair methods. The economic implications had captured attention beyond the preservation community. Insurance companies began offering reduced premiums for buildings that demonstrated exceptional flood resistance, including the surviving French colonial structures. Property values in the historic district reflected the proven durability advantage, with vertical post houses commanding premium prices despite their age and the specialized maintenance they required. Tourism officials promoted the vertical log houses as unique examples of early American ingenuity, though the interpretation sometimes confused French colonial methods with later American adaptations. Visitors could touch the original cedar posts and see cross-sections where basement excavations revealed the buried foundations that had anchored these structures for more than 2 centuries. Interactive exhibits explained the moisture management principles that made such longevity possible in a climate that routinely destroyed conventional wood construction. The irony was not lost on local residents who remembered their grandparents' stories about Baptiste's foolish building methods. The techniques that had been mocked as wasteful use of good timber were now recognized as sophisticated engineering that had solved fundamental problems of frontier construction. The deep foundation trenches, dismissed as unnecessary labor, had provided the drainage and stability that enabled survival through conditions that destroyed much newer buildings. Contemporary builders studying these structures found principles applicable to modern construction challenges. Climate change had increased flood frequency and intensity throughout the Mississippi Valley, making traditional building methods inadequate for long-term durability. The vertical post approach offered tested solutions for moisture management that could be adapted using contemporary materials and construction techniques. Dr. Martinez completed her flood damage assessment with recommendations that emphasized preservation of original construction methods wherever possible. The 1993 flood had provided dramatic proof of concept that could not be replicated in laboratory conditions. These buildings had passed a stress test that modern structures had failed, demonstrating engineering principles that remained valid after 2 centuries of technological change. The man who had stood his logs upright when everyone else laid them horizontal had built more than a house. He had created a demonstration project that would eventually vindicate traditional knowledge over conventional wisdom, proving that understanding natural forces produced better results than following accepted practices. The Mississippi River itself had served as the final judge, and its verdict favored the methods that worked with water rather than against it.